500 years before Columbus, Vikings reached North America. But what they found wasn't an empty wilderness. It was already home to indigenous hunters, traders, and warriors. Through archaeological evidence, the medieval voices of the Icelandic sagas, and stories preserved in Inuit oral tradition, we'll uncover the hidden story of the Norse in North America, and why they ultimately failed to stay. The story of the Norse journey from their original homeland in Scandinavia to Greenland to eventually the shores of what is now Canada begins with Eric the Red, named after his hair and fiery temper. Eric was born in Norway, but his life was shaped early by exile and violence. Around 960 AD, his father, Thorvald Asvaldsson, was banished from Norway following a series of killings that aroused from disputes with neighbours. As a result, Thorvald fled with his family, including Eric, then about 10 years old, to Iceland. Thorvald later died in Iceland, but the pattern of conflict continued into the next generation. In around 982 AD, Eric himself was exiled from Iceland after being involved in several killings, also from feuds with neighbours. This banishment forced Eric to journey westward, leading him to discover and ultimately settle Greenland. In this way, the exiles of both father and son set off a chain of events that would reshape Norse exploration. Thorvald's banishment drove Eric to Iceland, and Eric's own exile pushed him even further west to Greenland. Greenland offered land and space, but it turned out little else. The harsh winters and limited resources ultimately prompted further expeditions westward from Greenland, again into unknown territory in search of more land, and also the possibility of a new settlement. During this period, two main settlements were established: the eastern settlement, known as Eystrabygd, and the western settlement, Vestrabygd. Each supported a population of around 2,500 to 5,000 people, with a smaller settlement and smaller villages scattered across the landscape between them. It was more likely from the western settlement that the expedition set out. The Norse sagas describe that it was Eric's son, Leif, who led these expeditions. He was the second of the three sons to Eric the Red. Leif Erikson's story was recorded in several different sagas, but the accounts they give are so different it is impossible to be certain of the details of his life. He is thought to have visited Norway in around 1000 AD, where he was converted to Christianity by Olaf I, who sent him back to Greenland to convert the settlers there. In Eric the Red saga, on his voyage to Greenland, he sailed off course and arrived in a place he called Vinland, because of the abundant grapes growing there and the general fertility of the land. In another, the saga of the Greenlanders, he heard of a land in the west from an Icelandic trader and went to find it. In the Book of the Flat Islands, considered by many scholars to be more reliable in some aspects than Eric the Red saga, Leif learned of the new land to the west from an Icelandic explorer named Bjarni Hjörleifsson, who had been storm-driven there en route to Greenland about 15 years earlier. Although the sagas describing the landings differ in their details, the overall sequence of the voyage has been reconstructed by combining written sources with archaeological evidence, geography, and practical sailing logic. The first land sighted was a barren rocky region the Norse called Helluland, the land of flat stones, generally identified with the coast of Baffin Island or northern Labrador. In the saga of Eric the Red, it is said, they sailed away from the land, then to the Bear Islands. Thence they sailed away from the Bear Islands with northerly winds. They were out at sea 2 half-days. Then they came to land and rowed along it in boats and explored it, and found there flat stones, and so great that 2 men might well lie on them stretched on their backs with heel to heel. Polar foxes were there in abundance. This land they gave name to, and called it Helluland. The saga also says that Leif described it as worthless country with great glaciers and seemed to be like one great slab of rock. Sailing south, they reached a flatter forested land known as Markland, the land of forests, believed to correspond to the heavily wooded coast of modern-day Labrador. Markland was never recorded to have been settled, but it was a common spot for Vikings to go to harvest timber. Continuing further south, they encountered a milder, more fertile region where grapes were said to grow, which they named Vinland, the land of wine, or the land of grapes, likely located somewhere around the Gulf of St. Lawrence. In 1963, archaeologists found ruins of a Viking-type settlement at Meadows in northern Newfoundland, which correspond to Leif's description of Vinland. Soon after landing, the Norse realized that they were not alone. Nearly 5 centuries before Columbus, these Europeans came face to face with the indigenous people of North America. The first people they likely encountered were the direct ancestors of the Beothuk, called the Little Passage People, an indigenous group who once inhabited the island of Newfoundland. They referred to these newly discovered people as Skrælings, a word with debated origins. It has traditionally been translated as wretched ones or puny ones, with sometimes loosely rendered as barbarians. Others suggest it may derive from the Old Norse word skræ, meaning dried skin, possibly referencing the animal skins worn by Arctic peoples. Another theory links the term to a Norse word associated with screaming, perhaps alluding to war cries attributed to the Little Passage people. The Norse encountered the Little Passage people around 1000 AD, most likely near Meadows, where Leif Erikson had already established a temporary settlement, which he named Leifsbudir, or Leif's Booths in English. The Little Passage people were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who relied on caribou, seals, fish, and birds. They were skilled in manufacturing sharp-edged tools such as arrowheads and spear tips from locally sourced chert. The Little Passage people used a long spear for hunting caribou. A shorter spear was used to fish. They used weirs to guide fish into a pool where they could be easily speared. To hunt seals, the Little Passage people used barbed antler harpoons and used bow and arrows to hunt seabirds. We have no evidence of the sort of structures lived in by the Passage people, but we believe that they built temporary shelters, perhaps shaped like Plains Indian teepee, but smaller and probably covered with bark or perhaps hide. They are also well known for using red ochre on their bodies, which was extracted from iron deposits to coat their implements, bodies, and the remains of the dead. The color red played a role in the Passage peoples and their descendants' tribal identity. Disgraced band members might be ordered to remove the coloring as a form of punishment. It is very likely that the red hues also had spiritual overtones for the people. This extensive use of ochre led Europeans to name the Little Passage people the Red Indians. There are 2 accounts of the early interaction between the Vikings and the natives. They are the Saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's saga, known jointly as the Vinland sagas. The Vikings provide descriptions of the New World and its inhabitants in specific detail. The sagas seem very interested in the landscape and surroundings, noting the presence of wood, fish, wheat, and grapes. They also give us a description of the natives' characteristics. The best description of them we get is from Eric the Red saga, where it is said, "They were short in height, with threatening features and tangled hair. Their eyes were large and their cheeks broad." It is also mentioned that they slept under hide-covered boats, referring to their lightweight boats made with wooden frames covered in animal skins. When pulled ashore, they could be turned upside down and used as makeshift shelters. It's a practical detail that reflects life in the North Atlantic, where timber was scarce and every piece of equipment had to serve more than one purpose. After establishing a settlement and engaging in some small-scale interaction with the local population, the expedition loaded their ship with samples of Vinland's newly discovered resources, such as timber and grapes, and sailed east, back to Greenland. Leif himself did not return to Vinland, but others from Greenland and Iceland would later make the journey. In 1004 AD, Thorvald Eriksson, son of Eric the Red, and the brother of Leif Erikson, sailed with 30 men to Vinland to spend the winter at the camp his brother had built years earlier. The expedition would find no signs of people initially, except for on, what the sagas say, on one westerly island where they found a wooden stack cover. In the spring, Thorvald found 9 indigenous sleeping under 3 skin-covered canoes and attacked them. The 9th indigenous was able to get away, and soon the indigenous came back to the Norse camp in full force, killing Thorvald with an arrow that passed through the barricade the Norse had put up, although some say he was on his ship when the arrow hit him. According to the sagas, there would be brief hostilities, but the Norse would stay for another winter and leave the following spring. In the sagas, the following is said: "I have been wounded under my arm, an arrow flew between the edge of the ship and the shield into my armpit. Here is the arrow, and this will cause my death." The Norse were able to keep the indigenous away with their swords, but with the death of Thorvald, The Norse returned to the coast and buried him with crosses at his head and feet. This would make Thorvald the first known European to be buried in what would one day be Canada. 5 years later, in 1009 AD, Thorfinn Karlsefni, known as Thorfinn the Valiant, an Icelandic explorer, supplied 3 ships with livestock and 160 men and women to land at the Viking settlement in Vinland, and Thorfinn began peaceful relations with the indigenous there. The natives offered fur and grey squirrel skins, while the Norse offered milk and red cloth. The saga states that when the indigenous saw the milk, they wanted to buy nothing else. The indigenous, according to the sagas, tied the cloth around their heads. Thorfinn forbid his men from trading their swords or spears. It was that forbidden, one account says, that a Viking killed an indigenous man who he claimed was trying to steal weapons, probably of fear that their own weapons could be used against them. According to one story in the saga of the Greenlanders, a bull that belonged to Thorfinn stormed out of the woods, startling the indigenous, who got into their boats and rowed away. They would return 3 days, although some accounts say 3 weeks, later in force, and are described as hoisting a large sphere on a pole that was dark blue in colour and the size of a sheep's belly that flew over the heads of the Norse and made a sound described as an ugly din. In the attack, it is stated that the Norse retreated to a defensible position, and at the end, many of the indigenous were dead and 2 of the Norse were slain. And Freydis, the half-sister of Leif Erikson, who was pregnant at the time, was not able to keep up with the retreating Norse. She called out to them, stating that they should stop fleeing from, as she said, such pitiful wretches. She then grabbed a sword off the body of a dead Norseman, took out a breast, and struck it with her sword, frightening the indigenous, who fled into the woods. Thorfinn then came back for her and praises her for her courage. Historians still debate what this ugly din actually was. Some suggest it was a simple noisemaker, a drum, horn, or other instrument, while others propose something more dramatic, like a catapult launch projectile or even an early form of cannon. Whatever is true, it served as a psychological weapon, showcasing the natives' ingenuity that terrified the Vikings with unfamiliar technology. The Vikings chose to leave, stating in the sagas, despite everything the land had to offer there, they would be under constant threat of attack from its prior inhabitants. The sagas go on to say that the Vikings realized that even though this was good land, their lives here would always be dominated by battle and fear. With that, the experiment in Vinland by the Vikings ended. The main reason was that the indigenous were more numerous and knew the land better, while the Vikings were stretching their resources being there. No later sagas or annals describe any further voyages to Vinland after Karlsefni's return. Markland was visited repeatedly for timber, possibly as late as the 14th century. These timber voyages could have theoretically gone further south again. Eric Knupson, the Bishop of Greenland, would make an expedition out of Vinland in 1121 to convert the native peoples, but returned a year later. His journey outcome and discovery of Vinland remain unclear. Although he may have just been searching for existing Norse settlements or simply exploring the territory previously visited by Leif Erikson and others. Unlike their long-lasting settlements in Greenland, it seems the Norse never established permanent colonies in North America. Persistent conflict with indigenous people, combined with a lack of settlers to defend and sustain these outposts, made long-term occupation unviable. Instead, Norse sites in North America were likely short-term, seasonal bases used for expeditions, timber, and other valuable resources rather than true colonies. While it is unlikely that people lived there permanently throughout their entire lives, the Norse were nevertheless travelling to North America on a regular basis. Archaeological evidence supports this, including the discovery of Norse outposts on Baffin Island, in Newfoundland and Labrador, and at other Arctic locations, where clear signs of contact and trade with indigenous people have been identified. Over the course of the Vikings' time in North America, it is believed that they encountered at least 2 other distinct cultures along with the Little Passage people, the Dorset and the Thule. The Norse referred to these people collectively as Skrælings. The natives had a word for the Vikings too. Whilst it is not known what the Dorset and the Passage people named the Vikings, the Inuit word for the Norse is Kavlunite. While the exact origin is debated, some interpretations suggest the word may be related to people with eyebrows or eyebrowed ones, possibly referring to the distinctive appearance of the Europeans compared to the Inuit. Norse explorers encountered the Dorset people mostly in northern Labrador, Norse artifacts have been found at Dorset archaeological sites, and medieval texts such as Historia Norwegia describe people on the other side of Greenland toward the north. Hunters found some little people. Their situation is that when they are hurt by weapons, their swords become white without bleeding. But when they are mortally wounded, their blood will hardly stop running. They have no iron at all. They use missiles made of walrus tusks and sharp stones for knives. This is widely believed to refer to the Dorset. Contact with the Thule people appears to have been more extensive and occurred later, primarily in Greenland, but also possibly on Baffin Island from around the 13th century onwards. Archaeological evidence includes Norse-style metal tools, ship rivets, and even a small ivory figurine depicting a Norseman found within Thule settlements. Inuit oral traditions also preserve accounts of these encounters, including stories of peaceful interactions and archery contests between the Thule and the Norse, but also stories of violence and murder, but I'll talk about this in more detail later in the video. Based on interpretations of the Norse sagas, some scholars have suggested that it was the Dorset who the Norse explorers met in Helluland. The Dorset culture was a Paleo-Eskimo society that lived in the eastern Canadian Arctic and Greenland from about 500 BC to 1500 AD. They were highly adapted to cold Arctic environments and lived in small mobile groups with low population density. Dorset people were specialized marine hunters, relying mainly on seals, especially ring seals hunted at breathing holes in the ice. They used finely made harpoons and small stone tools, but unlike later Inuit groups, who are far more well known than the Dorset, did not use bow and arrows, dogs, sleds, or large skin boats such as kayaks or umiaks. They are especially well known for their art, producing detailed carvings of animals, human faces, and spirit beings from ivory, bone, and antler. These suggest a strong tradition of shamanism and animistic beliefs. In 1999, Canadian archaeologist Patricia Sutherland uncovered more than 24 whetstones and spun cordage congruent with previous Greenlandic Norse, discoveries that had been miscatalogued as Dorset artifacts at the Canadian Museum of History in Quebec. The finds prompted Sutherland to review hundreds of additional presumed Dorset artifacts, where she uncovered more spun cordage that originated from 4 excavated sites over the span of 1,000 miles of coastland, from the northern tip of Labrador to the northern tip of Baffin Island. The Dorset people were not spinners or weavers, as such clothing was impractical in the harsh Arctic climate. Rather, the Dorset people wore clothing made from animal skins. Sutherland argued that the finds are evidence of multiple contact scenario between the Norse and the Dorset people rather than a single contact scenario such as a shipwreck, suggesting the artifacts were distributed through trade. More excavations followed the discoveries, and Sutherland chose Tanfield Valley, Baffin Island, one of the 4 excavated sites that produced spun cordage. Beyond cordage and whetstones, Sutherland's new excavations uncovered evidence of a Norse structure. The finds included a whalebone shovel, Norse masonry, an old world rat pelt that had been brought to the Arctic by ship, and a toilet structure, all of which Sutherland called proof that the Norse constructed a camp in the Canadian Arctic. Tanfield Valley is not the only potential Norse camp in the Canadian Arctic. 2 cairns were discovered on Washington Irvine Island in 1875 that were unlikely to be Inuit in origin, leaving the only plausible constructors to be the Norse. Norse artifacts were found in the ruins of a house a short distance away, thus suggesting that Washington Irvine Island, more than 1,000 kilometers north of Tanfield Valley, may be the farthest north reached by the Norse. Walrus ivory sustained the Greenland settlements, but another lucrative trade was Arctic animal pelts that Indigenous people of the Canadian Arctic would have been superior at obtaining. Sutherland's excavations also uncovered potential evidence of a Dorset camp that prepared animal pelts within walking distance from the Norse structure at Tanfield Valley. As Sutherland insinuated, this evidence points to direct contact that could have been the earliest European fur trade in North America. The second piece of archaeological evidence that provides strong evidence are small fragments of copper from Ungava and Richmond Gulf. These small fragments are little amulets and other copper fragments. These pieces of copper are dated between 800 and 1200 AD. Despite being found near the Ungava Bay, these pieces of copper have the same iron and nickel composition as copper found in sheet copper from known Norse sites in Greenland. Composition analysis of the metal suggests that it's not native to the region and smelting occurred elsewhere. The pieces were found in a Dorset longhouse well into the Hudson Bay area. The Dorset culture did not build longhouses. These longhouses closely resembled that of structures from the Viking period, but the size is where the resemblance stops. Furthermore, in the same Dorset community, a trade axe was found. This axe has attributes that are consistent with the Norse origin of the period. Pieces of copper penetrating indigenous territory suggest relatively frequent trading. Copper and coinage would have been a luxury to both the indigenous people as well as the Norse settlers. As taken from the Vinland sagas, we know that the Norse primarily wanted wood and pelts, two items that do not stand the test of time. However, the development of trade utilizing metals shows an additional level of interaction between the two cultures. While these artifacts could have been acquired through pillaging, it is far more likely that trades were brokered between the Norse and the indigenous people that resulted in a transfer of coin and copper. Additionally, a complete soapstone lamp made of a characteristically Dorset style was located in the upper levels of one of the Norse buildings at the site of Meadows. The style of lamp is not seen in Newfoundland Dorset sites, but is commonly found in northern Labrador in late Dorset contexts. Given that the object is complete, it's most likely that it was brought to the site by the Norse after scavenging a more northerly Dorset site, or as an object of trade during one of their encounters with Dorset people in Labrador or in the Hudson Strait region. What would be the most convincing evidence to support direct contact between the Norse and the indigenous people of the High Arctic is carvings that share no resemblance to their native cultures. As previously stated, the Dorset were remarkable carvers, but the Thule too were skilled carvers, and both peoples had produced carvings that seemingly feature European characteristics in clothing. Archaeologist and anthropologist Robert Park, however, countered the argument that Dorset carvings depicted Norse people. The radiocarbon dating on the so-called European representations from the Nunavik archaeological site on the northern Baffin Island predated 870 AD, therefore making it impossible that the Dorset carving was a depiction of the Norse. Park instead argued the similar features were a coincidence which reflected that Dorset woodworking was simply more sophisticated and varied than previously recognized. The third group of people the Norse encountered, the Thule, occurred mainly in Greenland, but also the Canadian Arctic, particularly on Baffin Island and Ellesmere Island, between roughly 1200 and 1400 AD. These meetings took place as Norse settlers expanded westward from Iceland into Greenland and North America, while the Thule, ancestors of the modern Inuit, were spreading eastward across the Arctic. Hypothetically, they could have seen the transition from the Dorset to the Thule, where one group shrank in land territory and was gradually replaced by the other. At one time, around 1300, the Norse could have had contact with both groups at the same time, whereas before they would have only had contact with the Dorset. Compared to the Dorset, the Thule could have posed a much bigger threat to the Norse if the Norse chose to see them as such. Like the Dorset, the Thule originated from Alaska, where they mastered adaptation to the cold but rich environment. The Thule used larger skin-clad boats and harpoons for whaling, they used dogs for quick travel, and had adopted the use of bows. This would have made the Inuit very formidable to the small Norse settlements in North America and Greenland. A striking Thule carving dated to the 12th or 13th century was discovered at Okealivialuk on Baffin Island and is now known as the Bishop of Baffin Island. The clothing on the figurine does not resemble Thule clothing, but does resemble a front-slit tunic that was characteristic of 12th and 13th century tunics worn by Norse individuals involved in active pursuits. The details on the carving, which include a pectoral cross despite the Thule not yet having been exposed to Christianity, suggest that the carver had direct contact with its inspiration. A further variety of archaeological evidence supports that the Norse were entrenched in the northern Canadian Arctic and interacting with the indigenous Inuit culture. Charred oak, chainmail, a boat rivet, and a possible axe head were found on Skrælings Island. Out of these, the charred oak was able to be dated, and it dates to 1160 to 1440 AD. The Skrælings Island site contains 23 homes that match floor plans and building materials to other northward sites, including Ruin Island and Thule Meadows. These sites are near Ellesmere Island along the Baffin Bay. They show considerably large populations living there for a sustained period. Norse cloth dated from Ruin Island originated between 1043 and 1413 AD. There are hundreds of artifacts showing extensive industry such as ship rivets, iron knives, a woodmaker's plane, cloth, and a carving of a face. The volume of diverse materials indicates a thriving community, and the number of ship rivets, use of iron, chainmail, and other carpentry supplies confirms the heavy emphasis on ship upkeep. These were at extremely northward locations and locations further south, such as on Baffin Island, where a nearly 10-foot length of yarn of likely Norse origin was found, were likely established earlier and maintained longer than Skrælings or Ruin Island sites. The Inuit and Norse coexisted in Greenland for at least 2 centuries, and their contact was likely related to hunting and possibly trading activities. This establishes consistent contact between the Norse and Inuit as early as 1043 and as late as 1440 AD. In conclusion, both direct and indirect contact between the Norse and indigenous peoples of North America are likely to have occurred during the Norse occupation of Greenland. Recent archaeological evidence supports the theories of direct and indirect contact between the Norse and indigenous peoples of North America more than the theory of no contact. What is clear is that the Norse made the dangerous voyage from Greenland down to the coast of North America and settled, though briefly, in Newfoundland, Canada at Meadows, where they had direct contact with the local indigenous peoples. In the high Arctic, the probable image that emerges is that some form of direct and indirect contact between the Norse and indigenous peoples is likely to have occurred at Baffin Island. The contact is unlikely to have impacted either group more than the natives' role in the Norse abandonment of Meadows. The Norse were never large in number and were not diplomats for the Norse North Atlantic. The reality of Norse presence in North America was individuals rather than entire cultures that met each other for the first time in North America. We know the Norse were in North America around 1000 AD, and current evidence puts their occupation well into the middle of the 12th century. Trade certainly occurred between the indigenous and Norse populations during this era of early Norse Atlantic exploration. The settlements of Greenland eventually collapsed by the middle of the 15th century due to the Little Ice Age and the disastrous effects of the plague on Norway's population. Iceland, Greenland, and North America were isolated because of this population decline. This still leaves the history of the North Atlantic settlements between 1200 and 1450 AD unexplained. There is a wide range of evidence suggesting Norse contact through this period and with an eventual diminishing of North American colonies, ending the period of trade and communication until the European colonization years later. There was a distinct shift in Norse colonization away from Labrador and further north towards Baffin Island. 2 main hypotheses arise. First, the resources of Vinland were not significantly better than those of Markland were, and could have easily been acquired through trade if needed. Examples of Norse artifacts appearing further south of Meadows and buildings in indigenous villages that resemble Norse structures support this trade hypothesis, and highlighting the purpose of early Norse colonization efforts, wood gathering. The second hypothesis is that the Native American population became increasingly aggressive due to growing populations and political strife within the mainland. The primary objective of indigenous tribes was peace. Nonetheless, just as population pressure drove the Norse into Britain and Ireland, conflict between Algonquin-speaking hunter-gatherer societies, loosely organized into mobile confederated tribes occupying much of northeastern North America, and the rapidly expanding Mississippian culture, an agricultural mound-building civilization centered on the Mississippi River and sustained by intensive maize cultivation, pushed Algonquin groups further north. The Algonquin population itself was also increasing. Their political structure relied on highly mobile confederations rather than centralized authority, and they viewed land in flexible, non-juridical terms. The Norse exodus from this region between 1050 and 1100 AD lends credibility to this hypothesis. It remains impossible to determine whether indigenous people actively forced the Norse out, or whether a land vacuum created by northward indigenous expansion, as noted in the aforementioned hypothesis, ultimately caused the exodus. Inuit oral traditions passed down for generations include stories of encounters with Norse Vikings describing both violent conflicts and periods of coexistence, with some narratives even suggesting the Inuit eventually drove the Norse out of Greenland. Though these are collected late and blend fact with legend, these stories, rich in cultural meaning and moral lessons, reveal a complex history, contrasting with Viking sagas and archaeological findings of traded Norse goods, painting a picture of cultural exchange and adaptation in the Arctic. These stories were collected in written form during the 18th and 19th centuries by European missionaries and scholars such as Hans Edegge and Heinrich Rink, who recognized them as vital records of early contact. Evidence of Thule Norse contacts come from 4 stories orally passed down by the Thule to the Kalalit, their modern descendants. One describes a friendship between a Thule man and a Norse man, sometimes described as the chief or a high-status individual, playing a high-stakes archery contest where the winner of the contest would be permitted to push the loser off of a steep cliff to their death. The Inuit won the competition. Following the pre-agreed terms, the Norseman was pushed off the cliff. Another describes a Norse family running away from a non-violent Thule kayaker and drowning when they fell through a patch of ice. Another describes a Norse attack on a Thule household led by a hunter. The hunter's mother and daughters are killed while his wife survives. In revenge, the hunter massacres the Norse attacker. The longest story by far describes a full-scale war in which there are large casualties on both sides and the Norse settlement is partially burnt down. However, the archaeological record shows no evidence of this. Another Inuit oral story claims they came on floating islands. We met on good terms, we bartered, and we got along well. They settled near one of our villages. Then one day, while our men were out hunting, the Vikings murdered everyone in the village. Every man, woman, child, and baby was killed while our men were away. Our men were so distraught, they disguised their kayaks as icebergs to get up close to the Viking encampment just before dawn. Then our men murdered many of them in their beds. The rest escaped to their boats and floated away, never to be seen of again. All these stories feature the death of Norsemen in Norse-Thule interactions, and all depict animosity and mutual fear between the two groups. It is likely that the warlike natures of both groups combined with the strong cultural differences and the language barrier would have severely impeded even those relationships which were not openly hostile. One shared story between both peoples is one specific story about a Thule girl working as a servant on a Norse farm was found in both Icelandic and Inuit folklore, suggesting a degree of shared cultural memory. Interestingly, based on DNA analysis, it was found that 80 living Icelanders have a genetic variation like one found in indigenous people in North America. It is believed this variation entered the Icelandic bloodline around 1000 AD, when it is believed the first Viking indigenous child was born. It is believed, but not confirmed, that an indigenous woman sailed from Newfoundland to Iceland during the period when Vinland was active. The DNA lineage, called C1e, is passed down through a female, and the unique gene is present in 4 distinct family lines in Iceland, found during a decode genetic study. The Inuit do not carry the genetic variant. There is nothing in the sagas that speak of an indigenous woman going back to Iceland. What the saga of Eric the Red does tell us is apparently 2 indigenous boys were captured by the Norse and taken back to Greenland, taught to speak Norse, and are baptized as Christians, but that is all that is said and they disappear from the narrative. Ruins of Norse settlements still stand and are open to visitors in southern Greenland and at Nuuk, and we know famed explorer Eric the Red spent 3 years exiled on the landmass he called the Greenland. In southwest Greenland, you can visit Brathalith, the famed Vikings 10th century estate. There you'll find a replica of a Norse longhouse and a reconstruction of what many consider to be the first church of the New World, along with Greenland Norse cemeteries. And of course, the ancient Norse settlement of Meadows reconstruction is open to see, based on Norse longhouses from Greenland and Iceland, using wood, peat, and grass for insulation against the cold North Atlantic climate. The reconstruction shows longhouses, workshops, and living areas, reflecting a temporary base used for exploration, repair of ships, and seasonal habitation around 1000 AD. The cultural identities of Norse and indigenous cultures during the time were ripe for contact and trade. Both cultures had strong identities surrounding trade and realized the importance of trade. The circumstances of the Norse forced these cultures together out of necessity. These sources are voiced from the past screaming to be heard. The well-designed Norse settlement process, explore, pillage, settle, highlights the ability of these seafaring peoples. Scholars have been wary to support theories of Norse colonies in the Americas, but the evidence increasingly points towards not only Norse contact, but also sustained colonization. The Norse Indigenous relations were not without struggle and strife, but ultimately, the two cultures were able to find common ground and were able to trade without infringing on each other's sovereignty or culture.